everybody. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. I have a great guest today to talk about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and what that means for Afghans in particular. I'm joined by a researcher at the Michelsen Institute, Aziz Hakimi. Hello, Aziz, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start off by asking you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself from where you are in Afghanistan? And we can go from there.
Okay. Well, I've been originally from the south. That's where my parents come from. But I've lived in Kabul. I went to school in Kabul, and I've worked there for many years, and I've been in and out. So I haven't lived there sort of throughout my life. There were periods that I went out for studies. There were periods when I did a bit of work there, and then I left in 2017, and now I live in Bergen in Norway.
Very cool. And what is the situation like now in the area of Afghanistan that you come from?
Well, where I come from, it's it has been quite restive for many years because that's sort of I mean, I'm come from Paktia, so it's very close to Khost and Paktia and sort of Ghazni, and this whole area is basically used to be Haqqani stronghold. So there was quite a lot of fighting that was happening, and it still continues to happen. And just like other parts of the country, you've got sort of government presence in the center of the provincial capital, but sort of the outlying areas or deep into the countryside, it's insurgent territory, really.
So fighting continues. What's your academic and professional background?
Well, I did my doctoral research at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and my own research was on local militias and
Mm.
what at the time was known as the Afghan local police. These were sort of government-backed militias, trained and often supervised sometimes by the US military. They worked quite closely with the Afghan local police. They stood them up, and the idea was that you will have, if you like, proxy forces in the fight against the Taliban.
Mm.
It's, as you probably remember, in 2008, 2009, the insurgency started sort of, making its presence felt. It started spreading from the south to the center and then to the north and east and west. And I did my doctoral research in Wardak, which is quite close to Kabul. And when I was doing my research, 2010, 11, and 12, uh, Wardak was really, really, it was not only was very close to Kabul, but it was also, sort of very restive. There was quite a lot of fighting. And then I continued my research in the north, in Baghlan and in Kunduz, where, of course, the insurgency spread. And so it was sort of I simply followed the Americans and their programs as they sort of kept because it started in Wardak as a pilot project, but then they took it to the north and then later on to the south. Yeah, so
So all
that's
over.
yeah. I mean, at one point it was in 32 provinces
Wow.
in the country, close to at one point. I mean, the numbers all the time it changed. They changed all the time, but the government figures and the U.S. military figures talked about 30 to 32,000 armed men, and
Mm.
all over the country in groups of small groups, probably a couple of dozen, and so they were not. These were not sort of big formations. They were small units in remote villages, often badly paid,
Mm.
badly armed, uh, um, but nonetheless, in totality, an important element of sort of this broad effort, both by the U.S. and NATO forces, as well as the Afghan government, to sort of keep the Taliban, if you like, at bay and secure the major population centers, really.
And it worked. I mean, it worked sometimes, it didn't work other times.
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question, really, to answer because
There's no one answer, right?
no, because it all depended on the local context. In some places, they were quite effective, if you like, in terms of providing a modicum of security. In other places, for example, in Kunduz and in Baghlan, instead of protecting the local population, they became the predators.
Mm,
And sometimes because different groups were armed, instead of fighting the Taliban, they would fight each other for control of
mm,
territory and influence and power. So it was a patchwork. It was in every situation. And I studied the Afghan local police in 3 provinces, and in each province, the dynamics were different. The conflict history was different. The power relations were different. And these groups, the way they emerged, the way they also evolved over time, the kind of relationship, of course, they had with power holders in Kabul. Uh, you know, so the dynamics were very different, and the outcomes were quite different.
of course. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you did with NGOs in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I started work. I worked with the Red Cross and the International Committee of the Red Cross back in the Taliban days, really. In Herat on sort of the border with Iran. So quite a lot of my work was meeting Taliban authorities at the time, going to prisons because as you probably know, the Red Cross mandate is to visit prisoners of war and political detainees. The Red Cross also run refugee camps and internally displaced camps. So that was my initiation, if you like, into the world of NGOs and humanitarian action. And later on, I worked a bit for the UN mission in Afghanistan. I also run a local media group, radio and print media, and also work for the Afghan government actually, yeah, for a few years. So I've been, if you like, all over the place really. Yeah,
Right. That's really interesting about the media. You still run the media outlet now.
I don't. I mean, I
Oh,
was there
okay.
for a few years. But then I left. I went to the UK and I pursued my studies, but
So you've
didn't
written
return back.
you've written in the past about the failures of the U.S. military counterinsurgency efforts to understand and influence Afghan culture. Can you describe that?
Well, I mean, I did it in the context, of course, of my doctoral research on the Afghan local police. At the time, there was this assumption that something, an authentic, if you like, and an authentic, how should I explain it to you? Let me see. That there existed some sort of an authentic tribal, cultural understanding among the Pashtuns, the Arbaki concept that local tribes uh, provided their own security, and they had their own understanding and organization of how to protect themselves. So that idea, which it has at times, even during the early 20th century, Afghan royal governments relied on sort of these kind of arrangements where the center would provide some sort of support and have local sort of tribal forces that protected, say, natural resources such as forests. They
Mm,
were not necessarily there to uh, uh, you know secure, if you like, a village or secure a district or fight on behalf of the government. They were very much a sort of a local sheriff, if you like, that tried to resolve local disputes or put a cap on conflict so it didn't become it didn't spread. But the Americans, of course, with very sort of how should I say, uh, almost a Oriental understanding of Afghanistan, took that and then run with it, and try to sort of try to make use of it for their own agendas. Of course, the agenda was to find a local proxy force that could fight the Taliban. I mean, I described this in a paper that I wrote in 2013. The brutalization of the war. So what you got basically, the Americans funded these local militias, named them the Afghan local police. But the idea was uh, for them to fight the Taliban, so that the Americans didn't have to. So that this was Afghan lives were cheap, and they were given a little bit of support. And because of course they were already, and in the past they had been either allied with the Taliban or fought the Taliban, or before that during the Soviet period when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, these groups were there. They didn't come out. I mean, they were always there. They always changed sort of loyalties. They put on different names. So in one way or another, they were involved in local power struggles. So when the Americans came and sort of gave money to one group, and that sort of tipped the balance of power and got to use them against the Taliban for a period. It worked for a while, but as that support was withdrawn, the dynamics again changed, and that was the kind of and in that sense, it wasn't effective. It wasn't. It was a stopgap measure, really. I mean, the idea was you would fund these local militias. You would get them to fight the Taliban. It gave the Americans and NATO forces some breathing space in order to then focus on training the Afghan army and the Afghan police, the national army and the national police. And that was the kind of thinking, and the idea was that once they had served their purpose, they would be stood down. But once you arm local forces, they take a life of their own and they get
Mhm.
involved in local power struggles, and it's not easy. I mean, disarmament in Afghanistan has never really worked, even under the auspices of the UN. In the early 2001 and 2002 or 3, some old weapons were brought in, and they were handed in, but in that kind of environment when everybody was insecure, it just didn't make sense for a lot of armed groups to give up their weapons and sort of relinquish power. So they kept their weapons, and when the Americans came around and wanted to give money, they just volunteered. Yeah.
It's a kind of, yeah, naivete, very much in American fashion. So that said, how do you see, I guess, Afghan communities? I know this isn't an easy question because it depends who you're talking about, but how do you see Afghan communities responding to the prospect of a US withdrawal?
Well, I mean, again, you will have to study it at the local level. Don't forget, in a lot of places, the Americans have already withdrawn. Places like
Mhm.
Kunar, places like, say, Baghlan and Kunduz and Wardak. So for the past couple of years, maybe 4 or 5, it's been the Afghans, the Afghan army, the Afghan police, the Afghan special forces that have been doing the fighting. I mean, don't forget that thousands of Afghan security forces have died fighting the Taliban, And both the Americans and the Afghan government have admitted that, at the rate that the Afghan security forces are dying or being wounded, it's just not sustainable. They just can't keep. They just can't keep it up. So even if you have the money, even if the Americans say, okay, we're going to withdraw, but we will continue to fund the Afghan security forces, the money may be there, but in terms of human lives lost, in terms of the ability to then recruit new, uh, you know, new soldiers and sort of new policemen, it's just uh, to me, it just seems that we can't keep this. We can't keep we can't keep going on at the rate that we're losing lives. So at some point, uh, things have to change, and yeah. So in that sense, mm,
You,
this has been going on for a long time.
right, it's been like a gradual withdrawal. It's
Yeah.
it's it's right. It's not accurate to call it a withdrawal now. It's been in
Hmm.
kind of a slow motion retreat over the last several years.
Yeah.
Um,
It started in 2012. Remember?
mhm. So, I mean, what will the consequences be of withdrawing what's left? I guess
Exactly. I mean, we're talking about what, 3,000,
20. Yeah, and then I guess another 6,000 or
4,000?
so NATO troops.
Yeah,
Right,
so
not
in
very many.
totality, maybe we are speaking about 8,000 troops who, by the way, are not doing the fighting, who are mostly in their bases. They may provide logistical and aerial support, but it's already, for the past, whatever, half a decade, it's been the Afghans doing the fighting, shedding blood and killing.
Right, and that's how it's going to continue, I suppose.
Well, we were all hoping that the negotiations in Doha and now that it's sort of spread to Istanbul would give us a sort of a political roadmap and before the Americans withdrew. I mean, there's also criticism of how the Americans managed this whole negotiation process. I mean, they've been criticized for handing too much to the Taliban too early and already agreeing to withdraw their forces before they had sort of uh, a political roadmap or a political sort of commitment from the Taliban. And unfortunately, we are where we are. The Americans are withdrawing. The Taliban is already saying we have won the war, and now sort of desperate attempts to get the Afghans to talk to each other. I remember very recently, I think it was the NATO Secretary General who said, "Oh, we're leaving, and we'll leave it to the Afghans to basically find a way to find a sort of a what was his exact words? To basically reach some sort of a political settlement and find a way to peace."
After
Uh,
20 years, yeah.
exactly. After 20 years and after you know mm, arming so many militias, after failure to negotiate with the insurgents and then find a political solution, sort of you basically washing your hands of this conflict and saying, it's up to Afghans to now find peace. And
So,
I find that very, very cynical.
so we most associate Pashtuns with the Taliban. How has Pashtun society changed, and how have the Taliban evolved since 2001?
Well, that's an interesting question because uh, I mean my own understanding of the conflict and how it has evolved since 2002 or three. Uh, the Taliban have, I think, even if you look at the negotiating team in Doha, have demonstrated that they're not just a purely Pashtun phenomena. They're active in Badakhshan, they're active in the north, they are active in the west. So in that sense, they've been able, even among Uzbeks and Turkmens, surprisingly. And one of the things that the Taliban have always been, to some extent, quite successful in projecting, they projected this idea of a sort of a non-Pashtun movement, a non-ethnic movement, inspired by Islam, of course, and Islam is a unifying force in a multicultural society like Afghanistan. So for the Taliban, to call the Taliban a Pashtun phenomenon, I think would be a grave mistake. And in that sense, that's why they've been able to recruit Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turkmens, and at some point even had allies, among the Hazaras in central Afghanistan before the Americans arrived. So the Taliban have always demonstrated an ability to negotiate, to find a common path really with others. And of course, in a conflict, when you're the most powerful force, you know, there will always be others who would be willing to join you, and they may overlook sort of differences or histories or conflictual histories, as the Taliban have demonstrated. So in that sense, it seems to me that as the situation changes and American and NATO forces withdraw, I think the Taliban will have I mean, it will have an upper hand, of course, in the sense that they will there will be quite a lot of local forces that would see it in their interest to ally with the Taliban rather than with the government, and that's my fear. And in quite a lot of even in previous conflicts, we haven't really seen the kind of decisive victories or one force overrunning a province. It's always been these kind of basically invitations really to come in and take part. Even when the communist government, Najibullah's government, collapsed in 1992, I mean, in the common, if you like, the common wisdom is that the government collapsed and the Mujahideen took over. But in reality, for example, when I studied the power relations in Kunduz and Baghlan, the communists were pretty much there. They simply invited the Mujahideen and formed a sort of a local shura, a military shura, and an administrative shura, and it was a patchwork. Dostum is a very good example. How he allied with the Mujahideen and then took over Kabul and yeah. So in that sense, I think we'll probably see something similar where the Taliban would enter into alliances with local forces. They will probably not fight everybody.
That makes sense. And I mean, you spoke about some of the changes. I guess, how does that speak to how Afghan society has changed since 2001 as a whole?
Well, I mean, there's the rural Afghanistan where you've got the Taliban. The Taliban have emerged sort of from the hinterland, if you like. Of course, it has changed. It has been brutalized, first of all, by the Americans and NATO forces. And there's been quite a lot of, even in recent years, because of the fighting, there's been a lot of population movements. People, local people have had to leave their villages and come and camp basically in provincial centers. Recently, I did a study of IDPs in Kandahar, and I saw that a lot of local farmers had to leave their farms and their homes and run to the safety of Kandahar city, where they lived in miserable conditions, of course, in sort of IDP camps. So there you have that wave of population movement that's happening because the Taliban are taking over and are attacking sort of remote outposts, remote villages, remote districts. So yeah, so that's already happening, and of course, then there's this amazing urbanization that has happened in these big cities like Kabul, Herat, Kandahar, and Mazar-e Sharif. And I mean, I think, I mean, the trouble with Afghanistan is we don't have figures, we don't have sort of reliable figures. But I would say, the vast majority of the population now live in big cities
Mm.
under government control, and the Taliban may control more territory in terms of land mass, but in terms of mm, uh, you know in terms of population and population numbers, vast majority of them are now living in urban cities, and they have access to modern media, have access to healthcare, has its problems, but still, access have had access to jobs and opportunities. And there's, of course, there's large number of Afghans that have always worked, say, in Iran, Pakistan, are active in the Gulf countries, Turkey, all the way in China. I mean, I have colleagues who are studying Afghan traders, trading networks from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, China. This vast arena is open to Afghans, and Afghans are actively involved in trading. So it's a very complex picture, really.
Well, that's a pretty drastic change, like from very rural to city life to a completely different economy. And I guess like you mentioned before the sort of nuances of the Taliban and various groups that may ally with them. So in a more broad context, how are non-Pashtun ethnic groups dealing with the prospect of a return of the Taliban? And
Mm,
then from there, do you think there's likely to be an escalation of violence between Afghans or even a civil war after this full withdrawal?
yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. First of all, I'd like to correct this impression that
Mm,
uh, you know this kind of you said the country was rural and now there's sort of greater urbanization. That happened long before the Americans arrived.
mm,
If you go back and read some of the research that was done in the 1960s and in the 1970s, we already had a period when more and more people were moving away from farming and sort of rural economic activities to trade, and so urbanization was already a reality in quite a at least in big cities like Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, and others. uh, and there was, of course, Afghans were always active in the region, especially as traders. Uh,
mm,
and then, of course, the Soviet Union, the Soviet invasion, and that forced millions of Afghans into Pakistan and Iran as refugees, changed the dynamics, and the return, of course, also brought in Afghans back to the country with new skills, new aspirations, new lifestyles. And I mean, in my own family, people who were living in the villages went to refugee camps in Pakistan. When they returned to Afghanistan, they didn't want to go back to their local villages and be farmers. They wanted to live in cities. They had already experienced the benefits of urban or city life, and wanted to sort of pursue their opportunities in other areas and other economic spheres. So that's there. That's important to point out. In
mhm,
terms of the Taliban and civil war, and how the non Pashtuns relate to the Taliban. Again, it's very complex, and as I mentioned earlier, if you go to a region like Herat, there are non-Pashtun Taliban.
right.
So, if they come to power, or take more territory, does that mean that we are seeing a Pashtun encroachment into the west or the north?
Not
I would
necessarily,
say
yeah.
no, not necessarily. So there are already local forces be they Tajik or Uzbek or Turkmen, who shared the Taliban's worldview, of course, they have Islam, they have Islam as a common something that they all sort of can find common cause around it, and in that sense. I think we need to be a bit more careful in terms of drawing parallels with the 1990s. And that once after the Soviets left, the government collapsed, and then you had a civil war. I think, first of all, the Americans are not necessarily cutting aid as the Soviets did. So this government might go on for a few more years. And then there is also quite a lot of resolve, among the elites, if you like, the post 2001 elites who've been in power. They have resources, they have regional allies. So I don't see the sort of Taliban walking into Kabul, in a month or two after the Americans have left. So no, I don't think we're going to see the kind of collapse that we saw in the early 90s. And yeah, so in that sense, I'm not I'm not an alarmist, and I don't want to buy into the sort of alarmist ideas because they're self-serving
That's
primarily for
really
the Americans, because they would want to present this picture that we went there, we brought modernity, we brought human rights, we brought I don't know, sort of liberal politics. Once we leave, it's all going to sink. And because primarily the American generals were using that, saying, we should stay here, we should always maintain a footprint, because if we leave, then you're going to get a civil war and you're going to get Al Qaeda coming back. I think we need to take those assessments with a bit of yeah, with a bit of skepticism, healthy
that's a
skepticism, I would say.
that's a very refreshing take, because all we've heard in the US media, as I'm sure you've seen, has been this very alarmist, like, once we
Of
leave,
course.
Afghanistan is just gonna, fall into the or like fall into the ground, and the Taliban's gonna eat it.
Mm.
That said, what do you think were the flaws of the US negotiations with the Taliban? And how could it have been done better to take into account the interests of the Afghan people?
Well, the thing is, I mean, that's a very complex question, and you need to sort of go back to the early 2000s, 2001, 2002. Remember, there was this moment when the Taliban were willing to negotiate, but the Americans were, they said no. They were hurt. This was immediately after September 11th, and they had already invaded Afghanistan. They were already thinking of now going to Iraq, so they were on a war footing. And I think there was very little appetite for putting a brake on that. So they kept on fighting, and they kept on, increasing their involvement, military involvement in the region. And don't forget, we're talking about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and sort of the ending of the longest war in American history. The American military is present in close to 100 other countries. So this war is not ending anytime soon, even if they withdraw from Afghanistan. So that's, I think we need to reflect on that a little bit. But coming back to your question, I'm sorry, I sort of digressed a little bit. Remind me what we were discussing.
So I was asking you about, what do you think the flaws of the US
Oh
negotiations with
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
Taliban were, and how could it have been
Exactly,
done
exactly,
better?
exactly. So, as I said, in the early period, the Taliban were willing to talk, the Americans were unwilling. Then the Afghan government, around 2008, 2009, I remember I wrote a paper on the sort of peace negotiations at the time. The Afghan government was willing to talk to the Taliban, but the Americans and the British refused, and they said, no, it's too early. We need to sort of break their back, and sort of downgrade their power before we can talk to them. So again, we lost an opportunity there. And then, around 2012, 13, 14, when the Americans started to withdraw their forces, there was another momentum. But the reason we didn't see much progress is because there was this pretense at the time that we should have the Afghan government in the lead. And that was an obstacle because the Taliban simply refused to talk to the Afghan government, considering it, of course, as an American puppet. What Trump did, interestingly, is to sort of do away with that pretense and saying, okay, if the Taliban don't want to talk to the Afghan government, then we will talk to the Taliban directly. And that, unfortunately, had a very serious consequences for the Afghan government, as we can see now. It's in a very weak position to negotiate, even if it keeps calling on the Taliban, saying, "Come to the table, stop fighting, rebuild the country," and the Taliban simply don't take those invitations very seriously because you know why should they talk to the Afghan government when they can talk to the Americans? They they draw more legitimacy from talking to the Americans than they would from talking to the Afghans. So in that sense, the biggest, I think, mistake that the Americans made is to sideline the Afghan government and talk directly to the Taliban. And in that sense, that gave the Taliban quite a lot of international recognition and international prestige, which they have used very effectively. And now that you know, now that the Americans are calling on the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghans, it just doesn't make sense for the Taliban. Why should they? So for me, I think that was. I mean, one could argue that to break the stalemate, the Americans probably did the right thing by talking to the Taliban. But the way they've sidelined the Afghan government, unfortunately, is made it very difficult for the phase that we are in right now, sort of this intra-Afghan talks and intra-Afghan dialogue, because the asymmetry of power relation is just too stark,
Of
and
course.
I'm not sure how are we going to change that.
So I have to ask you this because this has been such a central part of the discussion. What do you think will happen to civil society and to women in Afghanistan with a U.S. withdrawal?
Oh, interesting. Thank you for asking that question because I recently saw an op-ed in the New York Times, and it sort of made me very concerned because you've got sort of uh, two aspects to this, really. On the one hand, you've got journalists, sort of, if you like, civil society activists and human rights activists who are rightly saying, rightly concerned about the American withdrawal and what might happen afterwards. Uh, uh, but that also plays into this kind of dynamics where the Taliban is seen as barbarians and the Americans are seen as liberators. And for me, that's very problematic. And on the other hand, you've got what I call sort of Talibanologists, those who study the Taliban, who've already abandoned sort of their interest in the Afghan government and in researching Afghan institutions and sort of state politics, and have tried to explain and try to really explain the Taliban to the Western audience, that they're running schools and that they've changed, that they even the term liberal was used for the Taliban in one recent opinion piece. So for me, that's interesting, but at the same time, it's also it's concern. It concerns me because it plays into these kind of dynamics where Afghan journalists are leaving the country seeking asylum in the US and Europe because they're for the right reasons, worried that the space is shrinking and they cannot. Quite a few journalists have been killed, they've been threatened, and that's true, and that's a reality. Um, but at the same time, that also plays into sort of this broader rhetoric that once the Americans leave, there will be no space for Afghan journalists and Afghan civil society and Afghan, if you like, reformers. And it happens, it had happened in the past, and it will happen now. Not everyone will leave. Some will leave, others will stay, and we all have to wait. We can't predict the future. This is the trouble with this kind of a discussions, because we don't really know what will transpire. So some of us will, of course, be alarmed at what we're seeing now, and may make decisions that may not necessarily be the right ones. And so, in that sense, yeah, I can. I don't want to speak for my colleagues in Kabul, for my friends in Kabul. I live in the safety of Norway, so one has to be aware of that. I don't want to sort of minimize the threat that quite a few of them face. But yeah, it is difficult. It is tough. It is. You probably follow the news. There has been quite a in the past, we would be concerned about suicide bombings. You are driving, you don't know when it's going to happen. A car next to you might explode. So to minimize that, you will, restrict your movements. You won't be, you try to avoid traffic jams and all that, or government buildings. But nowadays, it's the targeted assassinations. They come for you,
Mm,
and that's difficult. If you are on their list, what can you do? You probably will have to
frightening.
leave the country, and yeah, so that's very terrifying.
So, what do you think will happen to the current government in Kabul and the Afghan security forces? You kind of touched on this a little bit, but I guess in a more um,
Well,
elaborate.
yeah, I mean, it's I can't, as I said,
Predict.
I'm a researcher. I study object conditions. I can't predict what's going to happen, say, in the next 6 months or a year. Mm, but looking at sort of the past history, Uh, you know, if if NATO and the American government continues to fund the Afghan security forces, uh, they will remain an institutional factor. They will not necessarily disappear overnight. So we have to see for how long you know the Americans and NATO will provide, the 4 or 5 billion dollars that the Afghan security forces need. So that's one question. And then in terms of, okay, are we going to see any sort of political movements? If there's some breakthrough in the negotiations, and then we may not need to keep, 350,000 security forces, to fight. Then slowly we'll have to think about how to reintegrate, the insurgents, the Taliban and other groups, in terms of what immediately going to happen to the Afghan government. I think it will probably continue to stay in the cities, in the major urban centers, using its police and army. And don't forget, the Afghan government has now quite a good special forces that they rely on, that it relies on. CIA has its own, forces that is never acknowledged, but these are also very effective against the Taliban. That's the word you hear. So overnight, I don't think we're going to see Kabul sort of the Taliban entering Kabul anytime soon. You'll probably see a lot of intense fighting around urban centers, quite a lot of, as it happened in Kunduz. one day you'll have the government taking over, the next day the Taliban will overrun it, then the government will again send some forces and get the Taliban to back out. My feeling is that you will probably see a lot of that
Mm.
in and around major urban cities. This kind of back and forth action.
Do you think Afghanistan can exist as a stable, unified country, um, like experiencing development? And if so, what is needed to make that happen? It's a big question, but
Yeah, and this is an interesting question because even despite all the horrors of the civil war in the 1990s, Afghanistan did stay as a united country. We don't
Mhm.
have any sort of secessionist movements like the Kurds say in Iran or in Iraq. Uh, if despite all our ethnic differences, I think Afghans are still and surprisingly, they're very sort of attached to the idea of Afghanistan and the idea of Afghanistan as it exists now. So there will be, of course, jostling for power. There will be, calls for greater decentralization. And but Afghans have also, shown the ability to coexist. It's an ancient civilization. It's I was recently reading uh, some research on sort of the early Islamic period of how Balkh in northern Afghanistan was a place for, if you like, rebels who fought the Sassanid Empire. So my Afghanistan is not going to disappear anytime soon as a geography and as people. It will be there. The Russians left. you know the cast of characters will change, and I don't believe in this idea of state collapse and all that, because states don't collapse. It's a sort of different kind of social relation, and arrangements will have to be cobbled together. Different actors will Some actors will lose power, others will gain power, and those are the kind of dynamics that we will see. But one of the things that I'm actually hopeful for is that we will see, hopefully, a reduction in violence, the kind of violence that we see now, and at some point, Afghans will have to find a way to resolve their problems and work out some sort of an arrangement. It might not be ideal, but even after the early 1990s, when there was quite a lot of violence, fighting in the streets of Kabul. Slowly, even those Mujahideen parties managed to talk to each other, managed to sort of form coalition governments. They were not very stable, but nonetheless. And then the Taliban arrived, and at one point it conquered 90% of the country, and it was peaceful. It was peaceful. It was there, and then unfortunately the Americans arrived, so you got a very different dynamics. So we'll have to see. I will really have to see what will happen.
and then do you think that regional actors can play a positive role in helping to bring about that sort of peace in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, if you go back to history, our regional actors and our neighbors have never played a positive role, unfortunately. You've got these regional rivalries between Pakistan and India, then the Saudis and the Iranians. So it's all there. Of course, the Russians are a major factor here. The Chinese are to some extent. Uh, I think that consensus, there was an international consensus to see some sort of a stability in Afghanistan. I think that collapsed in around 2012, 13, and we've not been able to get that back. Maybe it was there, maybe it was all on paper, but at least that consensus existed. But now that sort of the major powers are withdrawing and are leaving, I think regional competition will increase. and Afghanistan, because of its geography, because of its position, unfortunately, is in a very weak position to then balance all these various forces. So there will be greater, I think, there will be greater regional rivalries. We will see greater regional rivalries in the coming years. But one thing that I like to correct, and this false notion that the Americans left Afghanistan, after the Russians withdrew. The Americans never left. They were always there. They worked for their proxies. You know, so the idea that the Americans abandoned Afghanistan, I think historically is incorrect, and I don't think
That's
they
a
will do that
fair
even
point.
now. They will
Uh,
continue to have some sort of support. Yeah.
they never leave. They never really leave.
No, they don't. No, I don't think so. I mean, don't forget that even if they leave, they will still be there in the region, and they will probably still find a way to work with local forces, be it the government or the Taliban within the government. I mean, the Taliban have also shown an inclination to keep some sort of a they keep the internationals happy because they would need the money, they would need some sort of development aid. So I don't think uh, this is sort of shutting the door and saying goodbye forever, because that's not the kind of future that I see for Afghanistan. It's an important country. It's an important. It has its importance in the region. The and so yeah, in that sense, we will see a different set of interests, but nonetheless, those interests will remain.
And finally, do you think the United Nations can remain in Afghanistan without international forces?
Well, don't forget the UN was there before the international forces. The UN will be there after the internationals have left. So the UN doesn't necessarily depend on the protection of the international forces. The ICRC is there. There will be NGOs. And so I don't think everybody's leaving. You might see the military actors and the military assets will be withdrawn, but I think in terms of development workers, NGOs, and the UN, I mean, the UN will have to play a very important role, especially if it comes to this kind of complex dynamics where different groups will have to negotiate and form alliances and some sort of a peace patch up some sort of a peace agreement. That's the traditional role of the UN, and I think the UN will probably be able to do more now that the Americans are leaving, because quite often the Americans were the problem when it came to
Mm-hmm.
the UN and it came to sort of some push for peace and push for some sort of a political settlement. So I think I see a greater role for the UN to play. Yeah.
Well, is there any, are you doing any final thoughts that you'd like to add that I didn't touch on?
Well, it's a difficult period for Afghanistan, no doubt, and quite often, even I mean, I live in exile, but your heart is there. It's a country that inspires me, the country that inspires my academic work. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful, and this in the past 20 years, there's been enormous changes have happened. A whole new generation um, was born and educated and have traveled abroad and have formed links with 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 the world, and those links will remain, and they are a source of hope for us, a source of hopefully some sort of a national rejuvenation. I believe in that. I don't think the country will simply turn into, yeah, as the popular media describes it, a black hole and a haven for terrorists. Hopefully, we won't see that.
Well, hopefully not. Thank you so much, Aziz, for joining me. I really,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate all of your work and your analysis. And I do hope that things uh, don't turn into the kind of alarmist talking points that we're hearing.